A Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature. You'd expect smooth sailing on climate change policy, but you'd be wrong. What happened to the governor's signature climate change legislation, and why? We'll ask Ron Lapsley, the president of the California Business Roundtable, Want Altamirano, the associate director of public policy for Audubon, California, John Myers, KQED's senior editor for California Politics and Government, and Dan Walters, the Sacramento Bee. Climate change legislation. Has the political climate changed?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
California's groundbreaking climate change legislation has or will impact almost every Californian in big and small ways. What are the concerns of California's business community as we attempt to tackle the problem of climate change? Our guest is Rob Lapsley, the president of the California Business Roundtable. Welcome.
Good morning.
So, California seems to have taken the lead on climate change. Do you see that as a competitive advantage or disadvantage?
So California is clearly a global leader in climate change. We are so far ahead of any other state, nation, or jurisdiction that the governor has been out working to bring them along with us in order to be able to tackle this problem. So is it a competitive advantage? We see this issue, number one, as something that needs to be addressed. So we need to be clear about that. Okay. The business community agrees that climate change needs to be addressed. The question that comes into this on a policy basis is how. How?
The devil's always in the details.
Always. And the details matter, and we have been working diligently with the policymakers on what those details look like. So everything that's moving forward on climate change is all about how you do it, not whether you need to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some industries, though, are going to do quite well with this climate change legislation. One of them is the solar industry. With this move toward the clean energy mandate, they're going to do pretty well with this new legislation, aren't
they? I mean, but they get subsidies to do that.
Right.
So, you know, that's a little different business model in how we
specific.
Get there.
Right. I mean, my understanding is that the solar industry in California is about $11 billion. And they're talking with this new legislation of anywhere between $8 and $10 billion more, almost doubling the size. So that's pretty significant. So listen, there are two pieces of major legislation that the governor and the legislative leaders wanted but didn't get. One was to cut fuel use by 50% by 2030. And the other was to roll back greenhouse gas emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. It's a mouthful. What was the basis for the business community's opposition to those two things?
Again, it goes back to the how. It's all about how does it get done and what are the safeguards to ensure, because we are so far out in front, that we ultimately do not become uncompetitive in terms of being able to attract business and create jobs. So when you look at where California is, our energy rates are a big factor in where job creation takes place. So we as a community have been working closely to talk about, look, when you set these goals and then you put them in law, we have to have some safeguards so that if we have a major downturn in the economy or our energy rates take off in a way that are maybe as an unintended consequence, we have to be able to know that we can come back to the legislature or the regulatory agencies and say, okay, we need to slow some pieces down. We have a too great a rate increase on our California families or on the businesses. And those safeguards were the big topic of the discussion.
It sounds like you're really, if I can synthesize it down to two things, you're looking at a cost-benefit analysis and you're looking at kind of a safety valve in case things happen that you're unintended consequences, which is always the problem with the legislation. You can't predict the future. Let me ask you this, though. One of the big issues was the role of the ARB, the Air Resources Board. Some want to limit the ARB's ability to write regulations. Others say, and want to give it to the legislature, others say, no, don't give it to the legislature because you'll just politicize an issue that really is a scientific issue. What do you think?
So when you look at this, again, let's start from kind of a foundation. What we pay for fuel in California averages about 75 to 85 cents above the national average, okay, for a variety of reasons. All about clean air, which has been a phenomenal success in California. Our energy rates are significantly higher than our surrounding states, and particularly when you look across the nation, anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So we start with that as what we pay for our leadership in this. So then you look at, with AB 32 that passed in 2006, we're just starting to get the cost information on what is happening under that. There hasn't been a strong cost-benefit analysis yet from the original legislation, and now we've just passed the next generation legislation under SB 32.
Sounds like the business community wants to catch their breath and see where we are.
Well, we're arguing that, and we're trying to show that we need to do all of this at the same time. You cannot, unless you have a good base of information of what's happening, you have to be careful about what you do with the next generation. That's why SB 32 didn't pass.
Yeah, it's interesting. Let me ask you about this, though. The Little Hoover Commission did a report a while ago, and they said, listen, in terms of limiting greenhouse gases, lots has been done, but not a lot has been done about adapting to the impacts of climate change. Should we be focusing more on the impacts of climate change?
So we should, and also I look at that from two things. One is, when we talk about our climate change leadership, what we don't see is a connection of the dots. And how I define that is, why are we not the largest single manufacturer that's creating thousands of jobs for all these new green technologies? Green jobs are 2% of the economy. We're trying to look out for the other 98%. Then you couple that with the mitigation impacts. Why do we not have the largest public works program building new water storage, for example?
That's
because we are going to need it under the climate change impacts.
That's one of the impact issues,
there's
for
the
sure.
politics of it.
Right.
But you can't do both and not have unintended consequences.
All right, well, I want to thank you for providing a business perspective on California's climate change actions. So what is the environmental perspective on California's climate change actions? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Addressing the challenges posed by climate change has galvanized the environmental community. So what do they think about California's attempts to tackle the problem of climate change? Too much, too little, or just right? Our guest is Want Altamirano, the Associate Director of Public Policy for Audubon, California. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
So environmentalists didn't get everything they wanted in the last legislative session, but they still got a lot. A 50% increase in energy efficiency in buildings, a requirement that California get half of its electricity from renewable resources by 2030, and you fended off an attempt to weaken the regulatory authority of the Air Resources Board, the ARB. So half a loaf, better than none at all?
Well, certainly the environmental community has thrived on a slow and steady pace over the last several years, and we realize you don't change the political landscape of a state that has 38 million people overnight. The last time the state renewable energy portfolio standard when it was updated, it took years of political battle. And this year, we're happy to say that it was done in one fell swoop. The other thing that I think is really important to remember is that while certainly we didn't get everything that we wanted, we were able to pass other landmark legislation in climate adaptation bills this year, which are going to be heading to the governor's desk and are critically important to helping the state adapt to this critical topic.
You know, I want to talk to you about adapting to climate change. The Little Hoover Commission did a report a while ago, and they said, hey, California's done a great job of focusing on lowering greenhouse gases, but they really haven't focused on the impact of climate change. Do you think the state should be doing more on that issue?
Absolutely. I think that the state should be addressing the issue of adaptation and climate change. The governor took a huge step forward on adaptation this year by releasing an executive order on requiring the Natural Resources Agency to update the state's climate change adaptation plan and adding adaptation to the state's infrastructure planning.
So the governor's doing something in that direction. Does the legislature need to do something?
So we sponsored a bill with Assemblymember Gordon, AB 1482, that currently is at the governor's desk codifying exactly this executive order of creating a statewide climate adaptation policy for the first time in history.
So it starts as an executive order, then it moves to legislation. And that happens a lot, by the way. That's not an unusual path for a bill to come into being. You know, there's also a lot of talk about maybe some of this action is going to be happening at the regional or local level. Is that what you see?
Certainly, again, very similarly, the legislature took action with Senator Jackson's bill in SB 379, which is signed into law. If signed into law, local governments will finally have the opportunity to incorporate climate adaptation planning into their general plan. So certainly, you're seeing a step in that direction, having the legislature push forward these initiatives.
Yeah, local communities. If you're in an area where they're prone to fire, dealing with issues where you know you're going to have more forest fires, or if you're in an area that's impacted by drought, like in ag communities, doing something to deal with water. I mean, those are kind of local impacts that we know are happening, and we can take some action to address them. I'm wondering, do you see any middle ground here? Where do you see progress around climate change going forward?
Well, I think that one of the things, sticking points this year certainly was that 50% petroleum reduction debate.
My understanding, though, is we're already going to get to, just with better cars and whatnot, we're going to already be at 35% reduction. So we're really only talking about 15% more.
Exactly. And so I think the important thing to remember is that Californians as a whole are behind making the cars that are cars on the road be more efficient. The cleaner the vehicle standards pass, the clean vehicle energy standards passed by Senator Pavley in 2009 have been the #1 most effective program according to the Air Resources Board in reducing petroleum consumption and improving the air quality. And I think the second part of this equation is that the state as a whole is cognizant and really recognizing that there is an important aspect of not only cleaning up, making our cars more efficient, but making sure that we serve those that are most impacted, communities of color.
The poor communities.
Yes, poor communities, and making sure that those impacts are lessened and reduced on those communities.
But that's one of the arguments, though, against a gas tax increase. They say, well, it's going to impact poor communities. That was one of the arguments against reducing gas consumption by 50%. Some of the moderate Democrats were saying, and most of them are from the Valley, were saying it was going to impact their communities, their poor communities more.
The thing that I would say is that we need to help these communities improve their local local air quality and increase their access to recreational opportunities like parks, rivers, wetlands, etc. So we can have a healthier, more livable community. That's something that we certainly embrace within the environmental community, but I think business as a whole also would agree with that.
Well, I want to thank you for that environmental perspective on California's climate change actions. Up next, the politics of climate change with two of the most respected observers of state politics, Dan Walters from the Sacramento Bee and John Myers from KQED. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Governor Brown has made addressing climate change one of the key goals of his administration. And by and large, he's been pretty successful, getting almost everything he's wanted. But not this time. So where does Governor Brown go from here? We've got two of the best Capitol observers to join us to talk about that and other things. John Myers, KQED's senior editor for California Politics and Government, and Dan Walters from the Sacramento Bee. Welcome.
Thank you.
So John, let's start with you. Republican opposition was expected on this climate change legislation. The governor seemed to have real problems with moderate Democrats, and many of them are from the Valley. Did the governor make a tactical mistake by not working more closely with the mods?
Well, in one way. I mean, I think, though, you have to broaden it out, though, Mark, and you look at not just the governor, you look at the Democratic leadership in the state Senate, which took these goals. I mean, the governor put these goals about renewable energy, energy-efficient buildings, and petroleum use in cars. That was the real bill we were fighting over. Took all those goals and put them in his inauguration speech. The Democrats in the state Senate memorialized them into legislation. But that legislation never really seemed to find any way to negotiate. I mean, especially on the petroleum issue. And I think there are some questions in the Capitol about how much the governor felt like he really needed the bill or didn't need the bill. I mean, he has a lot of regulatory authority, which we can talk about. And so, yeah, I think there may have been a little miscalculation, but don't underestimate the ability of the oil industry to make a very powerful argument and to make sure that its argument is heard.
Yeah, for sure. Dan, the role of the ARB seemed to be a big stumbling block in negotiations. There was one side that argues that ARB is just a bunch of unelected bureaucrats. that need to be reined in. There's the other side of the equation that argues that we don't want the legislature dealing with this because they're just going to politicize something that really is a scientific issue. But is that really not what's going on here? What's really going on here is this fight between the executive branch and the legislative branch, this age-old fight?
No, I don't think it really is so much a legislative executive branch thing. Look, you start talking about people's cars, their ability to drive, the cost of driving, you're talking about something that's quintessential. It's part of the fabric of California. And if you start messing around with that, you better have some good answers when people start raising questions about it. They didn't have any answers because they're saying, well, we're going to do that. We're going to cut by 50% by 2030. At the same time, by the way, we want to raise your gas taxes. And okay, so then you ask the question, well, how are you going to do this? How is it going to be done? They said, well, we could do a little of this, we could do a little of that, we could do a little of this. We could, but what do you really propose for us, we drivers? And that, I think, resonated. The oil industry exploited that. And in the poorer areas of the state, without a lot of transit facilities, places like the Central Valley and the Inland Empire, people are absolutely dependent on their cars. The incomes are not high, and they're very sensitive to the idea of something that you're going to mess around with me. And you're not telling me what you're going to do, you're just going to tell me what the final result is. Tell me what you're going to do. And well, they never answered that question.
And I think it's so interesting, Mark, that we look at what happens in courtrooms, or we watch television shows, right? And we see lawyers talk about reasonable doubt. Like, you just have to insert enough reasonable doubt. And the oil industry did a very good job, in my opinion, of inserting reasonable doubt into the bill with those members of the legislature, and even, frankly, with some members of the public, that just there was no way to get around.
So it was kind of a beyond a reasonable doubt
There's
standard.
one other thing in here. That mod block in the Assembly has been cultivated over the years with something like this in mind. And business groups have gone out and they've played in the top two primary system and whatnot, and they've developed this group of moderate Democrats who now hold basically the balance of power in the legislative system.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, John, the governor, it was interesting in his quotes. He has his
He's
zeal,
always interesting in his quotes.
His zeal has been intensified to a maximum degree. And the other thing he said, we're still on track. And you were talking about, you know, regulations that they actually can get a long way toward that 50% reduction in gas use. Just dealing with regulations. Forget legislation. Is that where we're headed? More regulations, less legislation?
I mean, I think the governor sees the writing on the wall. I mean, I think in a way that, you know, while the governor was disappointed probably that he didn't get the legislation, he's got this great foil now in the oil industry and the battle that he has picked on climate change. And yes, the Air Board has a tremendous amount of power. The governor controls it as part of the executive branch. This gets back a little bit to that executive branch issue. Regulation is a big deal. I think, though, you know, a lot of people would like to see more than regulatory power. They want statutory power. Because when one governor leaves and another governor comes, you don't know for sure that the regulations last. But yeah, I think we're going to get that.
You have to also understand that there has been some kickback on how the ARB has operated in the past. They've been rather arbitrary and decreeing this and that and the other, and then kind of expecting the public to accept it without really making much of a public case for what they're doing. They're just doing it, saying this is what we need to do, and they're not really going out there and selling what they're doing.
Okay, well, up next is the political climate on climate change about to change. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking to Dan Walters with the Sacramento Bee and John Myers with KQED and the California Politics Podcast. So Dan, climate change is a major initiative of Senate Leader De Leon. Do you think we'll be seeing more major legislation coming out of the state legislature in the next year?
More major legislation coming out of the state legislature this year? I think what you're going to see is a continuing division between the two houses. The funny thing about these two legislative houses is that at any one point, one of them tends to generate a lot of legislation and the other one's kind of reactive.
And who's
it
doing
goes
what?
back and forth and back and forth. And right now, at the moment, the Senate is being the generator, and the Assembly is being reactive. The Senate overall is several notches to the left of the Assembly right now, and there's that friction. So yes, there may be major legislation, but it has to overcome that split between the two houses. Particularly, it has to overcome this considerable block of moderate Democrats, maybe as many as 20. Who really have the balance of power now in the legislature. And I tell you, the fact that Tony Atkins, the Speaker of the Assembly, could not get them to follow the governor is an indication of the relative situations in the two houses.
John, I'm wondering, what about SB 32, Pavley's legislation,
Right.
80% reduction in gas emissions below 1990 levels by 2050? She's saying she's going to bring that back. What are your thoughts on that?
I believe she will. I mean, and I think, I think a couple of things would be interesting in 2016, Mark. I mean, first of all, in some ways, I think the discussion over the Pavley legislation, which is an extension of the current climate change law, got overshadowed by this fight about the other bill, about the petroleum use and the renewable energy and everything else. So it didn't get maybe the full discussion it needed in some ways. 2016 is an election year, and you're going to hear something about these issues and climate issues and all of that. And I fully believe she'll bring it back. I think it'll be a good debate to watch.
Well, there's also the proposition route.
Yep.
We got 2016, presidential election, more Democrats are likely to come out to the polls. You might see environmentalists like Tom Steyer pushing something. Will we be seeing?
Well, I mean, the guy's got a lot of money, right? I mean, if you've got a lot of money and you've got an issue in California, you can have a campaign. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win, but you can have a campaign. And I suspect Steyer wants to continue to drive the point home. One thing interesting, Mark, in the summertime, he stood out at a press conference in Los Angeles and talked about we need transparency in how gas prices are set in California. It was seen as a bit of a shot across the bow to the oil industry about the climate change stuff. I would not be surprised to see Mr. Steyer come back and make those kind of cases, and the voters would eat up something about gas prices.
Although if the gas prices continue to fall in California, that becomes a little less viable. But it's actually getting kind of late to start new ballot measures. I mean, if you have a ballot measure for the 2016 ballot, you should be out there with it right now.
But if you have a lot of money, you can do it.
Yeah, but
fast.
the threshold,
You can overcome-
the
you can
threshold is
overcome
lower
it.
though, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
What's
to
that?
get the number of voters you need to sign up to get it on the ballot is lower.
Relatively low because of the low turnout
Right.
in last year's election. But it's a possibility. But remember, rich guys have tried to get involved in politics before in California without conspicuous success.
Right.
I mean, the carcasses, they're littered, along the way.
Let me ask you this in terms of climate change and how it's impacting the state's water situation, Dan. Big push, certainly from folks in the valley about above ground storage dams, but you're seeing, this historic lack of snowpack. In addition, the success of conservation, is that hurting the case for dams?
It may be hurting the case for dams. There's a lot of things going on in water right now because of the drought. For example, Southern California is becoming much more self-reliant on water. They need less and less water from the north because they've built reservoirs, because they're doing reclaiming, their desalination and whatnot. So that's one thing that's going on. The other thing, the question is, if in fact climate change does what the experts say it will, which will mean we'll have less snow in the future, but more rain. In other words, maybe the total amount of precipitation won't be different, but it'll be more rain and less snow. Then that changes how you do. You need to be able to capture that rainfall because you do not have the natural reservoir of a snowpack. And so that changes the whole dynamic. I think I think the whole idea of what you do with water and how you capture it, how you conserve it, how you transport it is undergoing a tremendous change in California right now. Maybe it means we should do more underground storage from the rain rather than trying to capture that, because only the dams really only capture snowfall.
Yeah, ground banking, there's a lot of potential with ground banking. Last question quickly, John. I was going to ask you about some of the issues that might get bipartisan support, particularly the impact of climate change. Things like dealing with the drought or dealing with wildfires. Is that maybe a new way for the legislature to attack this problem?
I suppose. I mean, always smaller issues are bigger or better to get through the Capitol than larger issues. But I think the other thing that's interesting too is that we don't know what's coming around the bend. I mean, we've all talked about El Nino, for example. We don't know what flooding might do to change the debate and what kind of we do. As Dan talking about where you use that water. I do think that there is some consensus on some small issues, but these big issues, you've got these splits in the Democratic Party, and that's the thing to watch.
I guess we'll be watching that. I want to thank our guests, John Myers from KQED, Dan Walters from the Sacramento Bee, the California Business Roundtable's Rob Lapsey, the Audubon Society's Want Altamirano, for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can follow us on the Maddy Report by either looking us up on our website or checking us out on Facebook or Twitter. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.